The Vietnam War, or as they call it in Vietnam, the American War, was a protracted and savage conflict that scarred the lives of millions and left a nation divided. As the war drew to a close in 1975, the fall of Saigon marked a turning point in Vietnamese history. North Vietnam had outlasted the South and its Western allies and emerged victorious, reuniting the country under communist rule. The reunification, however, was far from peaceful. Years of hellish civil war, built upon vastly differing ideologies, had left the country deeply polarized and bitter toward their respective adversaries. And yet, there was a clear winner, and winners are the ones who choose what happens next. After the surrender, the North sought to consolidate its power and impose its ideology on the South. In doing so, it turned to a method of control that was as insidious as it was effective: re-education camps. These camps, known officially as re-education centers, were designed to indoctrinate former South Vietnamese officials, military personnel, intellectuals, and anybody who dared speak out against communist rule into the party's way of thinking. Yet behind the euphemistic language of re-education lay a horrific reality. For most, these camps were places of suffering, deprivation, and relentless psychological pressure. The North's revenge was methodical, aiming not just to punish, but to break the spirits of those who had oppressed them. The Vietnamese government had done its best to whitewash this entire period as it seeks to better its relationship with the West, but the statistics around the re-education centers were stark. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people passed through these camps, with some imprisoned for decades. How many died? We're not sure, but somewhere between 50,000 and 150,000 seems like a safe assumption. The war that raged in Southeast Asia between 1955 and 1975 has come to define that era, but little is known about what came next. The concept of re-education in communist ideology has really deep roots. Originating from Marxist-Leninist principles, it was believed that individuals who opposed communist rule could be transformed through intensive indoctrination and labor. This idea was not unique to Vietnam. It had been implemented in other communist states, such as China and the Soviet Union. In these countries, re-education camps were political and social control tools designed to eradicate counter-revolutionary thoughts and create loyal citizens. In North Vietnam, the seeds of re-education were planted long before the end of the war, during the struggle against French colonial rule, and later the American-backed South Vietnamese government. The North Vietnamese leadership observed and adapted methods of political indoctrination. They were particularly influenced by the Chinese model, which emphasized thought reform through a combination of rigorous study and communist doctrine, as well as hard labor aimed to break the spirit. However, we need to point out that perhaps the best example of re-education camps that inspired the North came from the South. In 1956, when the Viet Cong assassinated 450 government officials, the South ordered a mass roundup of suspected communists who were then interred in what can only be described as re-education camps. By 1957, nearly 70,000 had been imprisoned, with 21,148 individuals being killed during the process. As the war against the South progressed, the North Vietnamese government began to lay the groundwork for a post-war re-education program. Secret plans were drawn up and facilities were identified that could be quickly converted into re-education centers. These preparations intensified as victory seemed imminent, ensuring that once Saigon fell, the machinery of re-education could be swiftly set into motion. The re-education camps were not just punitive measures, they were a calculated strategy to ensure the ideological purity of the new, united Vietnam. The North Vietnamese leaders believed that by controlling the minds of their former enemies, they could cement their victory and build a cohesive socialist society. However, the horror that unfolded in these camps revealed the darker side of this utopian vision. In the immediate aftermath of the fall of Saigon in April 1975, a decree was swiftly issued, mandating the creation of re-education camps. This was shrouded in the language of reform and rehabilitation, but its true intent was clear: to strip the vanquished of their dignity, break their resistance, and reshape their minds. The legal framework provided the government with carte blanche to detain individuals indefinitely without trial or charge under the guise of the scarily vague term re-education. In May 1975, the newly established government in South Vietnam mandated that certain groups of Vietnamese citizens, such as ex-military personnel, government officials, and teachers, register with the authorities. They were then told to report to designated locations for re-education the following month. South Vietnamese soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted personnel were required to attend a 3-day reform study, where they would participate in sessions during the day and return home at night. Army of the Republic of Vietnam (ARVN) officers, ranging from second lieutenant to captain, along with lower-ranking police officers and intelligence agents, were instructed to report to specific sites equipped with enough paper, pens, clothing, mosquito nets, personal items, food, or money to sustain themselves for 10 days from their arrival date. Former high-ranking officials of the South Vietnamese government received similar orders, but were instructed to bring supplies sufficient for 30 days. In reality, for some high-ranking ARVN generals and officers, these re-education sessions stretched on for over a decade. The net was soon cast much wider, to include intellectuals, teachers, writers, artists, and known dissidents. Many teachers preemptively reported for re-education, believing that it was inevitable. Even the sick reported being reassured by promises of available medical care and proper treatment. The aim was comprehensive: to dismantle the intellectual and administrative structures of the former South and rebuild them in the image of the North. The location of these camps were meticulously chosen, scattered across the country, often in remote and inaccessible areas. From the dense jungles of the Central Highlands to the desolate regions of the far north, these camps were deliberately placed far from urban centers. This geographical isolation served a dual purpose. It prevented the detainees from escaping and minimized any potential for outside scrutiny or intervention. Within weeks, between 200,000 and 250,000 had arrived at the camps, and the true horror of what was happening was quickly evident. Life in the re-education camps was a grim, relentless ordeal designed to crush the body and spirit. Each day began with a piercing whistle before dawn, arousing the detainees from their fitful sleep. The first task was often a grueling physical exercise session designed to instill discipline. This was followed by a sparse, unappetizing meal, typically a bowl of thin porridge or rice gruel that barely provided the sustenance needed for the day's labors. The psychological torment inflicted upon the detainees was as severe as the physical hardships. Daily indoctrination sessions were compulsory, where prisoners were forced to sit through endless hours of political lectures and propaganda films extolling the virtues of the communist regime. These sessions were led by fervent instructors who drilled the principles of class struggle, the infallibility of the party, and the evils of capitalism into the weary minds of the detainees. This was typically followed by grueling self-criticism and confession rituals, where detainees were compelled to denounce their past actions and thoughts in front of their peers. Testimonies from former detainees paint a chilling picture of these sessions. Many recalled the psychological torture of being forced to portray their own thoughts and beliefs repeatedly. They described the relentless pressure to conform, the humiliation of public confessions, and the ever-present fear of reprisal if they failed to show adequate zeal in their re-education. The labor tasks assigned to the detainees were backbreaking, and they were ceaseless, ranging from farming and logging to quarrying stones and constructing roads. Under the blazing sun, or in the pouring rain, the prisoners toiled for hours, driven by guards who showed absolutely no mercy. The work was not only a means of exploiting the detainees' labor, but also a method of furthering their degradation and control. In some cases, detainees were forced to clear minefields without adequate equipment, the results predictably often being deadly. The aim of this was to erase the past identities of the detainees and replace those identities with a new, compliant persona. For many, the physical and psychological toll of the camps left deep, indelible scars. The promise of release was often dangled like a carrot, dependent on the detainees' willingness to conform and demonstrate their rehabilitation. Yet even those who were eventually released were often left broken, haunted by their experiences, and struggling to reintegrate into a society that had irrevocably changed. The conditions and practices within the re-education camps presented severe violations of human rights. Forced labor was rampant, with detainees coerced into performing grueling and dangerous tasks under inhumane conditions. This was very much slave labor. Due process was utterly absent in the operation of these camps. Individuals were detained without trial, often based on mere suspicion or accusation. There was no avenue for appeal, and detainees had no legal recourse to challenge their imprisonment. This lack of due process meant that countless individuals were held indefinitely, with their fate entirely at the mercy of camp authorities. International response to the re-education camps was swift and critical. Human rights organizations condemned the camps as brutal instruments of political repression. Reports from Amnesty International and other watchdogs highlighted the systemic abuses occurring within the camps, bringing global attention to the plight of the detainees. And yet, there was little that could be done. Weary from years of war, the United States and its allies wanted nothing to do with the situation. And as long as Vietnam had the support of the Soviet Union and of China, the government could do whatever it wanted. The UN stayed away as well, with the problem dubbed an internal issue. Those herded into the camps were effectively abandoned, and many never left alive. Due to the absence of clear guidelines for releasing inmates from the camps, bribes and family connections with influential officials often facilitated release more effectively than any display of good behavior by the prisoners. Once released, these individuals were placed on probation and closely monitored for a period ranging from 6 months to a year. During this period, they lacked official status, exit visas, access to government food rations, and the right to enroll their children in school. If their progress was deemed inadequate during this time, they risked losing their jobs, being placed under stricter surveillance, and even being sent back to the camps. Confronted with such daunting circumstances, many chose to escape the country and simply never returned. The process of closing the re-education camps was gradual and complex, reflecting both internal and external pressures on the Vietnamese government. By the late 1980s, under the leadership of Nguyen Van Linh, Vietnam began to shift towards economic reforms known as Doi Moi, aimed at revitalizing the country's stagnating economy. This shift necessitated a move away from the oppressive and costly camp system. Eventual international pressure and a desire for normalized relations with Western countries, particularly the United States, further accelerated the closure of these camps. Former detainees faced monumental challenges upon their release. They returned to a society that had moved on without them, often finding their homes and jobs gone. Many struggled to reintegrate, bearing the stigma of their imprisonment. They were marked as enemies of the state, and this label followed them, making employment and social acceptance difficult, if not impossible. The psychological scars ran deep. Survivors frequently suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other mental health issues, compounded by the lack of adequate medical and psychological support. The long-term impacts on detainees and their families were simply profound. Families who had been separated for years had to rebuild relationships amidst a backdrop of trauma and suspicion. Children who grew up without one or both of their parents in their lives carried the emotional and psychological burden of their parents' experiences. The social fabric of communities was irrevocably altered, with many former detainees and their relatives feeling like perpetual outsiders in their own country. The legacy of the re-education camps in contemporary Vietnam is a contentious and complex issue. Officially, the Vietnamese government has downplayed the harsh realities of these camps, framing them as necessary measures for national unity and ideological purification. State-sponsored narratives often gloss over the brutality and suffering, focusing instead on the supposed successes in transforming former enemies into loyal citizens. In society, memories of the re-education camps vary wildly. For many, especially the older generation who lived through those times, the camps remain a painful reminder of oppression and loss. However, younger generations, educated under a government-controlled curriculum, have a sanitized or skewed understanding of these events. The state's lack of open dialogue and acknowledgement has contributed to a fragmented collective memory. Historiographical debates surrounding the re-education camps among scholars both within and outside Vietnam vary wildly. Some historians argue that the camps were a form of systemic repression akin to the Soviet gulags, while others believe they were an unfortunate but necessary step in the chaotic post-war period. However, it is undeniable that the period represents a dark chapter in the nation's history that the government has done everything it can to gloss over since they closed. These camps, established in the name of ideological purity and national unity, were sites of immense suffering and human rights abuses. Vietnam has come on in leaps and bounds in the last 40 years. What was once a stagnant economy with a death grip on fervent communist ideology has become a vibrant economic regional power, but the grip of repression still very much remains. Dissidents, activists, journalists, and bloggers are still being jailed at an alarming rate. There are thought to be 160 political prisoners currently imprisoned in Vietnam, which doesn't sound like a lot when we've just spoken about potentially 500,000 people in re-education camps, but that's still a huge number being denied their fundamental human rights because of their political beliefs. We all know about the gulags, and the steady drip coming out of China has painted a horrifying image of the Uyghur education camps. But what happened in Vietnam after Uncle Sam left is a story not often told. It's a story of merciless re-education that went well beyond mere schooling, designed to break the will, destroy the dogma, and savage the soul.